when I was 8 years old, 56 years ago, that I would be standing here tonight to pay homage to the guy that turned me on, addicted me to the sport of pro wrestling. I probably wouldn't have believed it, because I was an 8-year-old kid who was enthralled with pro wrestling. But through the years, it led to an addiction that has, as I tell Scott, Stan Kowalski's son, turns to an addiction that has, I think, literally kept me alive at times. Because whenever I was down, wrestling was the drug that I took and paid attention to. And so I'm thankful for that. That said, when I was that 8-year-old kid, I turned on television one night in September of 1959, and this is no lie. There were two guys in the ring on black and white TV. They called themselves Murder Incorporated. And it was Tiny Mills, king of the Lumberjacks, and his partner, Krusher Kowalski. That's Krusher with a K. And I looked at it and I went, wow, I like this. They were just beating the crap out of some guy, and I loved it. So I was hooked. Well, as it goes, you know, this was an era in wrestling from the late 50s through the 60s, the 70s. Wrestling was so different than what it is today. We only had television to tell us to run, don't walk, to get your tickets to the local shows, local cards. And it was also an era where we weren't always allowed to get close to the wrestlers. The wrestlers were protecting the business. God bless them for that. That's the part I miss, believe me. And it was very hard to get to know these guys personally sometimes. But there was one thing I learned very early on. You know, in wrestling, there were good guys and there were bad guys. And sometimes, most often, it was the bad guys, the heels, that were the friendliest to the fans. Now, that's not all the time, but it just seemed to be the case. And so I got to meet guys like Nick Bockwinkel, Stan Krusher Kowalski, Mad Dog Vachon, Baron von Raschke. When he was still a pretty boy, Larry the Axe Hennig. And the list goes on and on and on. But one man, from that very addicting moment in 1959, was the guy that I guess has always stuck with me as being the guy, because he started it. So it's like that guy that gave you your first cigarette or your first drug or whatever it might be. And as I said, wrestling has changed a lot. By the time Stan was leaving the business in the mid-70s as an active wrestler, it was only about a decade or so later when the business started to gradually change and the territories were disappearing, and it became a new business, a new venture, a new world for new fans. But one thing I never wanted to do is I never wanted to forget and not acknowledge all of those great stars from the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who went out there 365 days a year, long before jet airplanes, traveling the highways 200, 300, 400, 500 miles a night to get to the next town to wrestle in front of their fans. You've already heard a couple people say that it's the fans that count. And one guy who was always so pleasant, so eager to talk after the matches, was this man. But there's also something else. I've been on the nominating committee of the George Tragos Luthez Museum for a lot of years. And the one thing that's really interesting is all of the great and talented and legendary wrestlers that are deserving to get into the Hall of Fame. And literally speaking, there are so many that it's going to be a long, long time for all of them to be included because we can only do 2 or 3 every year. And with that thought in mind, and I'm going to thank Kyle Klingman here because last October, once again, I sincerely felt that somebody was overlooked. And I called Kyle and I said, you know, according to my records, and I'll get to that second and that in a moment. I said, Stan Kowalski, and this was last October, he's going to turn 90 years old in May of next year. So this past May, 90 years old, Stan Kowalski. And I said, we need, without any doubt, we need to recognize Stan. All of this year's inductees were chosen already. Very tedious process. And Kyle, thank you. We went to work and we made arrangements that we were going to give a special award tonight. And I want to tell you something about this man outside of wrestling, because I think that's where we learn about the wrestlers. We know what they did in the ring. We know about their travels. We know about titles they held. He held 19 major titles, by the way, during his career. But we never hear about the things that they do outside the ring. One time, not too many years ago, when Stan Kowalski was asked how he'd like to be remembered when he passes away, you know what he said? He wants to be remembered for what he's done for the veterans. And I bring that out to you because tirelessly, for the last 50, 60 years, and we have a World War II veteran here, he has always been an advocate for our men of World War II and every veteran before and since, all of those that have passed and all of those that are still with us. He's been a member of the Legion, he's been a commander, and he's always been there for whoever asks him to be there, and with a smile. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of the United Way. Stan Kowalski has been a speaker and an advocate for the United Way for over 50 years. Every year, going around to businesses, companies, speaking and giving the cause of the United Way and how it helps all of those in need. And he's always been there to give those in need and give of himself. And that, to me, is a man outside the wrestling business that we don't hear about those things that the bad guys, the heels, did. This is also a man who was married for 52 years. Sadly, he lost his wife. Scott, was it in 2011?
Yes, sir.
Of 52 years, Cleo. And I'm going to share this part with you. His wife was the sister of pro wrestler known as Black Jack Daniels. So Stan and Jack Danielson were brothers-in-law. Of course, back in the kayfabe era, we never knew that. We weren't told that. But they were. So he was married all those years, and aside from that, here's something that's really interesting. When a guy gets to be 90 years old, and he's got 2 kids, Scott and Stacy, who have a twinkle in their eyes every time they look at him and talk about him, their dad is a superhero. And he is very proud of them, as well he should be. So these are some of the things that this man deserves to receive. And again, Kyle, thank you for letting us do this. I'm going to read this to you. It says, Lifetime Service Award 2016. The National Wrestling Hall of Fame, Dan Gable Museum, and the George Tragos Luthez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame recognizes Stan Kowalski for his lifetime of service to professional wrestling. Now, I do want to point out to you that Stan is here, and he's the kind of guy that will talk to you, and man, he's got some great stories of the road, many stories of his fellow wrestlers. You gotta love this man. And Stan, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I love you, man.